This is a great, great adventure story that I'm really, really looking forward to reading with you guys, discussing, and even reenacting some of the battle scenes from these next coming weeks. But before we get into that, I just want to make sure that you have some important background information to the story. It's a fairly old text, written in a pretty different world from the one in which we currently inhabit. So I just want to make sure that you have some important cultural, historical background information to the story so that you feel as comfortable as possible when we do start reading, discussing, and reenacting this book. Please do make sure that you pay attention during this presentation, as there will be a short quiz on some of the most important pieces of information from this presentation. We'll have that quiz tomorrow in class, so please try to refrain from falling asleep. And try to enjoy as well. Try to make as many connections as you can to the information that I'm presenting here, because Beowulf is it's such an influential story. In fact, J.R.R. Tolkien, author of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, was a Beowulf scholar, and you can start to see how he channeled some of the ideas and the characters and the plot elements into his works of literature as well. So please take notes, please pay attention, be ready for the quiz tomorrow, and we will start to discuss this book a little bit in class. All right, here we go. Okay. As far as the plot of Beowulf goes, there's not a whole lot of nuance to it. Basically, we have our main character, Beowulf, who goes out on various adventures, and along the way defeats a handful of incredibly terrifying monsters, one of which is named Grendel, which has a penchant for terrorizing human beings while they sleep at night. Beowulf goes after that creature. He goes after that creature's mother. He has an epic showdown with a dragon. It's really, really entertaining stuff. But please make note of the word archetypal, which I use here. And that word, it references this tendency in human nature, human storytelling, that there are these basic repeating patterns that we tend to hold dear because they show up in our stories over and over again. And you'll notice that some of the character types and some of the plot elements in Beowulf will resonate. You'll notice that these are things that have showed up in other books you've read, in movies you've seen, and that's why I use the term archetypal. It refers to these very, very basic repeating patterns in our stories that reflect something about who we are as humans, because we seem to bring these certain characters, these certain plots, these certain symbols, bring them up over and over again in the stories we tell over the course of thousands of years. So, as far as who wrote this book and when, it's a little bit complicated because we don't actually know who wrote it, and we don't actually know when the person wrote it down. Our best guess is that it was written down somewhere in a 300-year period in the Middle Ages, between 700 and 1000 CE or AD. As far as who wrote it down, we think it was probably a knight who was living in this area of England called Northumbria, which, as far as I know, doesn't get referenced anymore in the geography of the United Kingdom. But anyway, we think it was a monk because they tended to be some of the most educated people in the society, most literate, and they tended to be copying down books and works of literature. So it's sort of our best guess, and it makes the most sense. But even before this monk copied the story down, as we happen to believe, the story was told and passed down for most likely hundreds of years just like the Odyssey was originally. That was an oral story, and then finally Homer decided to write it down. In the society of the early Middle Ages in England, these bards or these oral poets were known as shopes. That's how that word is pronounced. It's not scops, it's shopes. So that's these are the rough origins of the story itself. Okay, to make matters a little bit more complicated, you might think that, okay, so a monk wrote this story down. He was living in England somewhere between 700 and 1000. So that's when the story was set, right? It was set in England. I mean, we were reading this in English literature, right? Well, confusingly, no. The story actually takes place many, many years, maybe hundreds of years before this monk actually wrote it down. And it doesn't even take place in England. It actually takes place in Scandinavia. So keep that in mind, that there's quite a bit of distance between when and where this story was written down and when and where it actually takes place. The story is set, like I said, in Scandinavia hundreds of years before it was written down. And Scandinavian geography looked, well, you'll notice a few names that are still with us today: Swedes in Sweden, Danes in Denmark. But it's a little bit different than our modern day sense of geography of Scandinavia. What you do need to know is that Beowulf, the main character, is from a tribe known as the Geats. And at the beginning of the story, he takes a journey to where the Danes are, in the purple there, south of where the Geats lived, to help them with a crisis which involves being attacked by a monster. Which sounds a little bit Godzilla-esque, I suppose, but again, those are those archetypes that get repeated. The other thing you need to know is that these tribes would be constantly fighting and making alliances, breaking alliances. It was going on continuously. So there are references to that in the story as well. But the two main tribes to remember for the story are the Geats, which Beowulf is a member of, and the Danes, the tribe that he goes to help at the very beginning of the book. An interesting thing, cultural phenomenon happened between when the story takes place and when the monk, supposedly monk, wrote it down. And that was a major, major religious transformation. Sometime around maybe 600 CE, Rome and the Pope sent missionaries to Northern Europe to try to convert everyone to Christianity. And they took to it pretty quickly. By approximately 650, almost all of England was Christian. Now, when the story of Beowulf takes place, Christianity wasn't really a thing in Northern Europe, at least. So the monk who wrote Beowulf down had this really bizarre task of trying to take a very, very pagan story and to Christianize it as much as he possibly could. So we'll see a lot of that going on too. There'll be a reference to Christ or other biblical figures, and then the next line will make a reference to very pagan beliefs. It's very, very strange, intriguing, almost combination or clash of cultures. Some other information that we should just know about the author of Beowulf. The exact time period he lived in was known as the Anglo-Saxon period. It got that name because after the Roman Empire collapsed, England, what we know as England now, was invaded by two tribes from what was approximately Germany, known as the Angles and the Saxons, very creatively. We know that he was a monk, so he was educated. And throwback to our Macbeth background, but he was living most likely during a time of violence and uncertainty when the Vikings were going out and attacking various locations all around Northern Europe, and even farther in some cases. So that's what was going on for the monk who supposedly authored this, or if you want to use the term author. The language that this poem is written in is known today as Old English. also known as Anglo-Saxon, which, by the way, looks and sounds nothing like the English of today. Just to give you a sense of what this does sound like, found this little video of Old English, which I'm going to skip through the beginning of this man dramatically walking down a sidewalk somewhere and try to get right to the poetry. I'm not sure who this guy is, but...
We gardena in gärdagom förkunninga trumjefronon Hofa ädlinga sällen främmedon Oft sylskivingskärderna 13-måniga mäton Modo sättla och ter Hej för det allas Sydan är det svärt färsett funden.
Okay, so that very dramatic fellow is reenacting the role of a Shope. And as you can tell, that sounds and doesn't have any resemblance really to the English of today. But that is our linguistic ancestor, Old English. A couple more things about Old English, at least Old English verse, which Beowulf was written in. It features, you'll notice these line breaks in your copies, translated copies, of course. We will not be reading this in Old English. That there are these line breaks called caesuras, and it means that each line of poetry was broken into two pieces. Each piece was known as a half line or a verse, and each of those had one stressed syllable. So it was a way for the Shope who was performing this to get into a rhythm, help him or her remember the story, because these are pretty long stories to memorize. We'll see these alliterations going on, term you probably have learned, a repetition of sounds. Something that you probably haven't heard of before are these things called kennings, which we'll see tons of in this book. And they're these very unique, metaphorical, artistic expressions to describe sometimes very ordinary things. And it's pretty unique to Old English literature. So, for example, we'll see things like blood get referred to as battle sweat, or Grendel, the monster, be called the guardian of crime. The sea often gets referred to as a whale road, and something as common and commonplace and commonly referred to in literature as the sun gets called the sky's jewel. Last couple slides here, just a couple of important themes and ideas to be aware of as we go through this book together. One thing that I want you to just keep in mind, especially when we get into some performative aspects of this book, is that this story was originally performed in a mead hall, which is where tribes would gather and drink tons and tons of mead. So there was this sort of celebratory aspect to it that was going on for the audience when they originally heard this story. Which could explain a lot about how the story is structured and what the original Shope's telling it we're going for. A couple other things to look out for. This does technically get categorized as an epic poem in the same category as the Odyssey. So be looking for some of those themes about a hero's quest, the values of a given society being demonstrated by that hero. There are also some elements of an elegiac poem about lamenting the loss of a loved one, which, well, without giving too much away, spoiler alert, never mind, I'm not going to give anything away there, but we can discuss that later on in the story. The role of women, or maybe lack thereof, is something that you can be aware of and perhaps even criticize. And very, very last couple of things. As I mentioned before, this whole thing is sort of an attempt to Christianize a pagan story. So we'll see those clashing elements of Christianity and paganism side by side sometimes in the book. And then, so there's lots of there are lots of references to Christianity, but there are some big pagan ideas that show up a lot in the story as well. 3 of those are listed right here. The first is this idea of the weird, which is this idea that life is sort of fatalistic and predetermined, and has kind of a dark, ominous side to it. A couple other social things from pagan culture. Um, there's this concept known as the were guild, which means that the translation of that is man price. If there is a person who is found guilty of murder or a crime, rather than that guilty person being punished by death or something similar, you could simply pay a certain amount of money and everything would be cool. So, um, oh, this guy got into a fight with my brother at the meat hall and killed him. Well, we don't necessarily want that guy to be put to death, but if he pays us a ton of gold, then everything's fine, as long as he pays for his crime with money. That didn't always work out, though, and these things called blood feuds often broke out, and that was where somebody hurt or killed someone in your family, so you want to get revenge by killing that person or killing that person and their entire family to get revenge to settle the feud. All right, well, that is our introduction to Beowulf. I know it was a lot of information, so if you need to rewatch this video, feel free. Um, Again, make sure that you are familiar with some of the major concepts and terms from this PowerPoint, as there will be a quiz on it tomorrow. Nothing super, super detailed, but I just want to make sure that you watched this and were paying attention. And very, very soon, we'll dive right into the story of Beowulf and get into his battle with the first monster, Grendel, which I can't wait for. I'll see you guys tomorrow, and enjoy your evening. See you guys.